something that he tries to crush or suppress. He understands our weaknesses, he sympathizes with our fears, and he is prepared to meet us if we are honest doubters seeking for answers. So when Moses had doubts, God was prepared to dialogue with him. When Abraham had doubts, God was prepared to help him through that. When Job had doubts, God spoke to him directly. And when Thomas had doubts, Jesus came to him and provided the very evidence for which Thomas was asking and looking. It's natural then for an intelligent, rational person who still has a deep faith and a belief in the Scriptures to occasionally feel doubt about their validity. It is natural, if we are intelligent, thinking human beings, to suddenly think from time to time, well, I really want to be sure that what I see in my Bible is what God originally caused to be written. I want to be sure that those events that are recorded in the Old and New Testament actually really did happen. And we know that's important to us. That's why, as Christadelphians, we have used lexicons and concordances to study the Bible in its original languages. That's why we have taken such a keen interest in archaeology concerning the Bible. We want to be sure, and so that we can be honest about preaching to other people. So, in this session, I'd like to address several key areas of doubt. One is about textual transmission and accuracy. Basically, is the Bible that we have today an accurate representation of what God caused to be written all those years ago? And this is particularly important because, as we know, many people attack the Bible on this very point. And of course, the average village atheist will try and attack the Bible in this way and say, well, how can you be sure that what you have is remotely similar to what was originally written thousands of years ago? Then I'd like to look at some issues concerning archaeology. Bible archaeology, of course, is a very big subject, and I'm going to try and limit my remarks on that to a couple of key issues. And then I'm going to have a look at some of the evidence which confirms the reliability of the New Testament and its record of historical events. I'm going to start by looking at the question of whether or not we can trust that the Old Testament and the New Testament have been transmitted accurately to us through the centuries. We know that they've been copied by fallible men, and what we really need to know is whether or not this copying process has provided us with an accurate representation of what God originally caused to be written. Now, there was a lot of consternation and a lot of excitement when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and after that time, and even today, you can still find people who are deeply convinced that there's something in the Dead Sea Scrolls which proves the Bible is wrong or contradicts the accuracy of the Bible, or proves that the Bible has been inaccurately transmitted. But once again, what we find is that popular ideas are very different to what professionals say. And when we find professional commentary on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the accuracy with which the Old Testament has gone down to us, we find this, yes, we can rely on the Old Testament. The scrolls confirm the reliability of the Masoretic text, which was previously the oldest text available to us, thereby adding almost 1,000 years to the antiquity of the Hebrew text. Previously, we had Hebrew texts which were much younger than the Dead Sea Scrolls, and people would say, well, these scrolls, these texts were written thousands of years after Moses, thousands of years after David. How can they possibly be accurate? But the Dead Sea Scrolls were over 1,000 years earlier again than those Hebrew texts we previously had, and they have proved that the Hebrew scriptures have come down to us in a reliable manner. And so we find again the scholars saying the textual evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in fact, confirms the general reliability and stability of the text of the Old Testament as we have it today, whilst at the same time offers evidence of important early witnesses to textual variants, just like the New Testament. So we can actually be confident in the fact that we have the Old Testament as it was originally caused to be written by God. And the Old Testament, the accuracy of the transmission of the Old Testament has been confirmed overwhelmingly by the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the same way, the many available texts of the New Testament have confirmed its accuracy and the accuracy of its transmission. The New Testament is preserved in far more manuscripts than any other book from antiquity. And some of the ancient books like Homer's Iliad, the plays of Euripides, and the Annals of Tacitus, the 1st century Roman historian, are actually preserved in only a handful of books. Fewer than 700 copies of Homer's Iliad, fewer than 350 copies of the plays of Euripides, and only one copy of the first 6 books of the Annals of Tacitus, whereas the New Testament has over 5,000 manuscripts, which we can use to determine that it has been transmitted to us accurately. The Alexandrian text of the New Testament is found in manuscripts produced by scribes trained in Alexandrian scribal practices, the best of its kind in Greco-Roman times. Such scribes were schooled in producing well-crafted, accurate copies, so we can trust and rely on the New Testament as it has come down to us, having been transmitted by the best scribes available in those times. In any event, those scribes produced reliable copies that largely preserved the original wording of the New Testament writings. It is to these manuscripts that we look for the preservation of the original wording of the various writings on the New Testament. And again, I'm quoting here from standard secular scholarship. I'm quoting from professionals whose job it is to investigate these matters, professionals who have no interest in supporting the Bible, who may not have any interest in the Bible whatsoever. They're just studying the text and they're just reporting the facts. We can have some confidence in the reliability of the New Testament as we have it today. And so we find that even when we can compare all the thousands of New Testament manuscripts, we find that there is a remarkable agreement. And even among all these thousands of manuscripts, many of which, yes, have some accidental omissions or some scribal errors, we find an incredible agreement. Thus, in nearly 2/3 of the New Testament text, the 7 editions of the Greek New Testament which we have reviewed are in complete accord, with no differences other than orthographical details, that is, the spelling of names, etc., or the misuse of a few letters here and there. This result is quite amazing, demonstrating a far greater agreement among the New Testament texts of the New Testament during the past century than textual scholars would even have suspected. So in the second half of the 20th century, when even more Greek Testament texts were discovered and scholars continued to investigate them, they found that the more Greek Testament scripts, the more New Testament manuscripts and texts were discovered, the greater the agreement between them and the more reliable the New Testament became apparent. The more the reliability of the New Testament became apparent. Now, it is true, of course, that, as I said, average atheists will try and attack the textual accuracy of the New Testament in particular. And you will find that one of the people they cite in this regard is a man called Bart Ehrman. And there are 2 reasons why they cite Bart Ehrman. Firstly, Bart Ehrman used to be a Christian. He used to be a very conservative fundamentalist Southern Baptist, and then later he deconverted and is now at best an agnostic. So atheists like to quote him because they consider him unbiased. And it's true, he is unbiased. He's certainly not biased towards Christianity. And another great reason why atheists like to quote him is because Bart Ehrman has been and still is one of the greatest textual scholars of the New Testament. He has been one of the authorities on the texts of the New Testament, and he is widely recognized as extremely professional and highly regarded in this field. And he's written a couple of books which give the appearance, at least to some people, that the New Testament is unreliable. And some people quote parts of what Bart Ehrman says, and they make it appear that he is making a comprehensive case against the reliability of the New Testament. And what I'd like to do now is show you some of those passages from Bart Ehrman's works which are typically quoted, and then put them alongside the facts as reported by other scholars. So you will find, for example, atheists will quote you statements like this from Bart Ehrman. Mistakes multiply and get repeated. That is, as scribes copy the New Testament texts, mistakes multiply and get repeated. Sometimes they get corrected, and sometimes they're compounded. And so it goes for centuries. And a soundbite like this makes it sound like Ehrman's thinking, oh, well, the New Testament is hopelessly corrupt. Generation after generation, Century after century, sloppy scribes made errors which got worse and worse. But in fact, when we look at other textual scholars and we look at what they really say, they say, well, actually, the great majority of these variants are inconsequential, involving spelling differences that can't even be translated, articles with proper nouns, so minor grammar errors, word order changes and the like. Indeed, only about 1% of the textual variants are even both meaningful and viable. So we find that, in actual fact, even though, yes, there are many small differences and variances between these numerous New Testament texts, in most cases, they're completely inconsequential. A dropped letter here, a repeated word, and maybe a slight grammatical error or slight difference in spelling, absolutely inconsequential. And then you find maybe a statement like this thrown at you by Bart Ehrman: the more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of scribes, who were not only conserving scripture, but also changing it. And that sounds like the typical atheist conspiracy theory. Once the church got hold of the New Testament, they changed it every year and every century to fit their beliefs. And they changed it and they changed it until finally the New Testament, which we have in our hands today, is so completely removed from what it originally was. We have no way of even knowing what it originally was, and what we have now is completely unreliable. In actual fact, even though there were some changes made, even for some theological reasons, the number of changes wasn't nearly as dramatic as that. In fact, intentional theological changes, as we are told here by this theologian, intentional theological changes make up very, very few of the textual variants in the New Testament, and therefore, on a relative scale, have little significance. The vast majority of scribes, in fact, did not intentionally change the text whenever they felt like it. So it's important to know the facts. It's also important, in fact, to know what Bart Ehrman himself writes in other parts of his books, which are typically not quoted by the average atheist, probably because they've never actually read his books, like people like myself, and they've only just taken a few snippets here and here, which they found on the internet, and a few sensationalist newspaper headlines. I actually find that the best person to answer claims by Bart Ehrman is, in fact, Bart Ehrman. Now, I will show you some of these statements by Bart Ehrman, internationally recognized textual scholar, and this will show to you that, in fact, Bart Ehrman himself comes down very strongly on the general reliability of the New Testament text and its tradition, even though he is not a believer anymore. So here are some statements that you will not find used by the average atheist when he's quoting Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman acknowledges that textual variants in New Testament texts increase the likelihood that scholars will uncover the original text. He says that 30,000 textual variants, 30,000 differences among various texts of the New Testament do not detract from the integrity of the New Testament. And he says out of these 30,000 textual variants, what sounds like a huge number, he says most of these differences are completely insignificant, immaterial, of no real importance. Bartman goes on to say the copying of the early Christian text was, by and large, a conservative process. They didn't radically alter the text whenever they felt like it. The ultimate concern, he says, was not to modify the textual tradition. And he acknowledges also most of the changes found in our early Christian manuscripts have nothing to do with theology. And he goes on to say they're the kind of mistakes that you would typically expect from somebody staying up late at night and copying the light of a candle when really he would much rather be doing something else like sleeping. And he says we know very well that scribes became tired, they became irritated. In fact, there is an entire field of studying the marginal comments of scribes. Some scribes, in fact, wrote things in the margin of certain manuscripts. Some personal notes, actually, some of which are rather hilarious. Some of them are talking about, oh, my wrist aches, and those people always cut the wicks of the candles too short. I can never get enough light. Or somebody else who's copying from from somebody else's manuscript. He says, "You idiot! Stop changing the text like this. Try and be more accurate." And so, as Bart Ehrman says, these kind of little marginal notes show us that nothing more than we already knew, that scribes were human beings like we are, and sometimes they made mistakes, and most often those mistakes were the result of tiredness, fatigue, or simply errors as they were reading. There was no great big conspiracy to change the New Testament text in a way that conformed to church doctrine. So when you're confronted by the writings of people who are trying to throw Bart Ehrman at you and trying to shake your faith in the textual accuracy of the New Testament, Bart Ehrman is in fact one of the best people you can quote back to them. Now I'd like to look at questions of archaeology. And archaeology, of course, has always been one of the mainstays of Christadelphian preaching. We've always used archaeology to demonstrate the truth of the biblical record and to prove that it has a divine origin. Now, it must be acknowledged at the outset, when we are honest with ourselves, that there are still some archaeological challenges. There are some big archaeological challenges. I've listed here some key archaeological events, or key historical events in the Bible, for which there is little or no archaeological evidence. It doesn't mean they didn't happen, it just means it's very difficult to prove that they did happen. And we should be aware of that, and we should be honest about it. The lives of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. It is extremely difficult when you go back 4,000 years to find individual records of individual people, especially by name. We may well find the bones of the camels of Abraham, but how would we ever know? We're certainly not going to find anything written on them saying property of Abraham. So we have to be aware of the limitations of what archaeology can do for us. We have to be really realistic about what archaeology can and cannot prove. There is a lack of evidence for Israel in Egypt, and there are very good reasons for this. One of the reasons is that in the Nile Delta region, where Israel was, most of the Egyptian records for that region have actually been destroyed, partly by wars and partly by numerous invasions from other countries, even in ancient times, and also due to the fact that Egyptian records were written in papyrus, and in the damp conditions of the Nile Delta, they simply did not survive. In fact, it's ironic that we have texts from many thousands of years much older than Egyptian records, simply because those earlier texts were written on stone rather than on papyrus. There is a lack of evidence for the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan as we have it in the Bible. We can't find records of the Egyptians referring specifically to a man called Moses. And of course, when we come to the archaeology of Canaan, we don't find records of the local people writing about this crazy man called Joshua leading these Hebrews and coming and conquering us all. And again, we have to be realistic about what the archaeological record can and cannot demonstrate. However, what we can prove and what we can see and what professional archaeologists will acknowledge is that there is good evidence that Israel was in Egypt. And there is good evidence that a body of people called the Hebrews left Egypt and entered into Canaan around the time that the Bible says. Beyond that, we are limited as to the amount of detail that we can provide from archaeology. But we do know that these events took place. There is a lack of detail concerning some details of the monarchy, some of the historical record of the monarchy. We're not going to find letters between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, for example. And King Solomon's temple, as we all know, has long since been destroyed, built over so many times that there is no trace of it now remaining. But given the overwhelming evidence of archaeology supporting the rest of the Bible, even these relatively major issues are not a problem in the overall scheme of things. What we find when we look at what professional archaeologists say, especially archaeologists who are not religious and have no interest in supporting the Bible, we find there is good, solid evidence supporting the Bible. I'm going to quote now from William Dever. William Dever is a very well-known archaeologist. He's a North American archaeologist. He's a secular humanist. He has no interest in God. He's not remotely a believer. But he takes strong issue with those people who claim that archaeology does not support the Bible. He says there are some who claim that the Bible contains little or no historical information about ancient Israel. And he says, I want to combat these minimalist or revisionist views of the history of ancient Israel by showing how archaeology can and does illustrate or illuminate a historical Israel in the Iron Age of ancient Palestine, roughly 1200 to 600 BC. That is from the time just before David, all the way down to the Babylonian captivity. And he goes on to say, if the biblical Solomon had not constructed the Giza Gate and the city walls, then we would have to invent a similar king by another name. He said there's no point, once we've got this archaeological evidence in front of us, there's no point saying, oh yes, well, okay, the evidence there seems to support the Bible, but how do you know that was really Solomon? He said, well, honestly, if it wasn't Solomon, basically, we have no other candidates. There's simply nobody else. If it wasn't Solomon, we'd have to invent another king by another name, and then you might as well just call him Solomon. And again, here's another archaeologist, Israel Finkelstein. He's another secular archaeologist who has no interest in supporting the Bible's claims. And he says archaeological excavations and surveys have confirmed that many of the Bible's geographical listings, for example, the boundaries of the tribes and the districts of the kingdoms, closely match settlement patterns and historical realities in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, that is before Common Era, before the time of Christ. This is remarkable because Finkelstein is one of the more skeptical archaeologists, but he freely acknowledges there is a great deal of support, archaeological support, for the biblical record. Equally important, says Finkelstein, the biblical scholar Baruch Halpern, who is another secular Jewish archaeologist, showed that a relatively large number of extra-biblical historical records, mainly Assyrian, verify 9th to 7th century BCE events described in the Bible. So he says, quite apart from the archaeological evidence on the ground, other scholars have shown that other records from other nations, such as the Assyrians, which aren't even records in the Bible, confirm events which happened in the Bible. So once again, we can go outside the Bible and we can find evidence for events which happened in the Bible. We can go to the Assyrian records, and obviously the Assyrians had no particular interest in supporting the Bible, but they recorded events and their own interactions with Israel, and their interactions with Israel, the historical evidence that they left, and the records that they left, show and prove to us that the Bible's historical record of these events was accurate. So, in the broader scheme of things, we don't really have to worry about biblical archaeology. Yes, there are some gaps in the record, and we do need to be honest and open about those gaps. But at the same time, we don't really need to be particularly concerned that the Bible is being undermined by archaeology. It certainly isn't. Now, there is, however, one particular event described in the Bible, in the Old Testament, which remains a major point of contention. And I'm sure people are very well aware of this, and it was illuminated yet again by a recent movie directed by Aronofsky, which was the famous Noah movie featuring Russell Crowe. Curious choice, perhaps. Russell Crowe for Noah, not exactly my first choice, and he was predictably about as angry as he usually is, and as I expected he would be. I don't know why it is, but Russell Crowe always seems to be portraying angry people. I think he's a basic angry kind of man. Now, once again, we had this story that simply won't go away. The Genesis flood story, the story of Noah, the story of the ark. It is, in many ways, the most momentous, the most dramatic of the Bible stories, and it has always been a battleground for atheists, because it is seen by many atheists as the easiest way to disprove the Old Testament, the easiest way to disprove the Bible. And if you can just nail Noah and you can disprove the ark and the flood, then you've gone a long way to disproving the entire Bible. So let's face this head on and look at what we can tell from the archaeology that we have at our disposal. Let's look firstly at the ark as we see it in Aronofsky's movie. This is the ark as described and depicted in Aronofsky's movie. As you can see, apparently steam-powered. An absolutely ridiculous space for an ark. Aronofsky, obviously, not a seagoing man. Now, what I'd like to show you, what I'll show you later, I'm going to show you some archaeological evidence which provides a very good understanding, certainly a much more accurate understanding of what the ark would have looked like. Now, of course, we've all seen a lot of very classical European depictions of the ark, which are equally as ridiculous as Aronofsky's. But what I'd like to show you a little later is how archaeology, genuine archaeology, actually provides us with a much better picture of the ark and a much better understanding of how it would have been built. Now, one of the big issues of the ark, of course, is this question of the flood. And even in our own community, the issue of the flood has been a subject of enormous discussion. And it may interest you to know that from the earliest years of our community, starting with Brother Roberts and continuing for many decades, it was widely accepted that the ark did not, that the flood of Genesis did not, in fact, cover the entire globe. And if you'd like to have a look at a particularly persuasive article, in fact, this was the article that persuaded me that the flood of Noah did not actually cover the entire globe. This is the article written by Brother Roberts in his book, The Visible Hand of God. He provides a considerable range of evidences and puts them together, and he says that, as a result of his discussion of this evidence, he said, it would seem reasonable to conclude that the flood was coextensive only with the Adamically inhabited portion of the globe. In other words, the flood only covered that area of the earth which was populated by people. He said there are facts that compel such a conclusion, and for several pages he goes into all the various scientific facts which lead him to this conclusion. And he says, as all facts are of God, they must be in agreement. Now, I'd like to recommend that article to you if you are remotely interested in this, but it is important to realize that this was the earliest Christadelphian interpretation. The earliest Christadelphian interpretation of the flood after Brother Thomas was that of Brother Roberts, and he held, for reasons which he explains very ably in The Visible Hand of God, that the flood was geographically local, that it only covered the area in Mesopotamia where man had spread, and it did not cover the entire earth. And he gives many reasons for this, and I invite you to read those, since I can't go into all of them in detail right now. What is very important, of course, to understand is that this idea that the flood was local and it did not cover the entire earth is not a recent invention. Certainly it was not invented by Brother Roberts, nor was it as an invention created by Christians in the modern era to try and solve or get around scientific problems. On the contrary, in fact, the local flood interpretation is the earliest of the interpretations found in the Jewish writings and the Jewish commentaries, going all the way back to Philo of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus, who lived in the 1st century. Both of those men interpreted the flood, the flood of Noah, as a local flood, in the same way as Brother Roberts. Rabbinical writings from the 1st to the 4th century also interpreted the flood as local. Some of the rabbis interpreted it as universal, as covering the entire planet, but others disputed this and pointed to textual reasons why they said no, in actual fact it really is referring only to a local area of the globe. And even within Christianity, the Syrian Christians from the 3rd to the 4th centuries also believed the same reasons as the Jewish writers. They believed that the flood was in fact local, did not cover the entire globe, and it was only caused by God to only destroy the people whom God's judgment fell. And that's a very important point, because if we understand that God only judges those who are responsible, then we will understand that the flood was only local to those people who were being judged, who had heard the preaching of Noah, and who were being judged for rejecting it. And this is some of this you can also find alluded to in the writings of Brother Roberts if you read his article. There is evidence in the text of Genesis itself and in the text of the Bible and also outside the Bible also indicating that the Genesis flood was local. Some of the language we find in Genesis 6 verse 17, 7:4 and verses 19, 21 and 23 does sound like a completely universal flood. All the high mountains under heaven and all flesh in which was the breath of life. But we find those same phrases used elsewhere in Deuteronomy 2, 24 to 25, for example, speaking only of the inhabitants of Canaan. And we find those same phrases used in Ezekiel 38, verse 20, speaking only of judgment on Babylon. So this apparently universal language, which seems to be talking about the entire world, is in fact used elsewhere only to speak of local events. And it's really talking about the scale of the judgment. It's saying the entire world of those people is being turned upside down. And we find the same language used, of course, in the New Testament, even though it's in Greek. A well-known challenge to the idea that the flood was local is the fact that Genesis 6 verse 4 says there were Nephilim around in those days and after the flood. And that's a particularly important verse. And it's backed up, that interpretation is backed up by Numbers 13 verse 33, which says plainly that there were descendants of the Nephilim in the land of Canaan. So Genesis 6:4 says there were people called Nephilim who were already around in the time of Noah, and Genesis 6 verse 4 says they were still around after the flood. So obviously they survived the flood. And in Numbers 13 verse 33 we find the descendants of the Nephilim. Then there are also other textual records from other cultures. There are textual records of people who recorded a great flood. And we find that those textual records are confined to a very particular geographical area. Outside that, for example, you only had to go to Egypt and they knew nothing about the flood. Didn't even reach them. Then there, of course, is the archaeological evidence. And again, we go down to Egypt and there's no evidence of a flood. No pyramids, no tombs, no buildings damaged by a flood. No evidence that there was a flood which even got as far as Egypt. Then we find evidence of flooding itself confined at a particular time to Mesopotamia. Now it's true that you can find evidence of great flooding all over the earth. But the problem with all those flood layers is that it's very clear they all happened at different times. What you really need, if you want to talk about a global flood, is one single flood layer that covers the entire planet. And no such flood layer has ever been discovered. And Brother Roberts makes this point very strongly in his own article on the flood. That's one of his strongest points. And he says geology and archaeology shows to us that there is no evidence for a geographically universal flood. Now, what we can demonstrate very clearly, however, is that there was a flood around the time of 2900 BC, which is exactly around the time that Genesis records the flood of Noah. And this is well not acknowledged and comprehensively recognized in the professional archaeological literature. That's not even in dispute. So the atheists who want to say, oh, of course, Noah's flood was a complete myth, well, they are running hard up against professional literature. On balance, the archaeological evidence seems to point to a flood of particular severity at about 2900 BC, which might be the basis of literary themes about a worldwide flood, attested first in Mesopotamia and then in other parts of the ancient Near East. So he said there was this big flood, there was a mega flood around 2900 BC, and as a result of that flood, which was recorded by the people at the time, people living much later developed the idea of a worldwide flood, even though it had never actually happened. But it was so severe that the people living much later built up additional legends about that. And another professional commentator writes, such inundations, such floods, either overtaking different areas at different times or accumulating into a catastrophic flood that inundated the entire region around 2900 BCE, as some scholars suggest, are marked archaeology. There is evidence for a flood of the entire Mesopotamian region around 2900 BCE, which is distinctively marked archaeologically. And you can see multiple independent professional sources arriving at this same date. Around 2900 BC, there was a Mesopotamian mega flood which completely destroyed civilizations and resulted in records of this flood. And again, the cities that bore the brunt of a massive flood, all at the same time, around 2900 BC, were the middle cities of southern Mesopotamia, which would have contained Adamite populations, would have contained the descendants of Adam. And again, this from a professional climatologist, accounts of Mesopotamian floods, perhaps a massive flood at the end of the mid-Holocene crisis at 2900 BC, passed down in Sumerian tradition, was certainly the root of the Bible story. That massive flood was at the root of the biblical story. So we can find multiple independent professional sources looking at the archaeological evidence saying, yes, we can agree there was a flood. It was a massive Mesopotamian flood exactly around this time, around 2900 BC, which is at the time that Genesis places the flood of Noah. So there is archaeological evidence, rock-solid archaeological evidence, for a very large Mesopotamian mega flood around the time of the flood of Noah, and we would be foolish to ignore that evidence. And as Brother Roberts points out, that evidence leads us in one direction, that there was a flood and it simply wasn't cover it. It simply didn't cover the entire earth. And that's okay, because the Bible, as Brother Roberts explains, doesn't actually say that it did. Now, what is also important, and is known to some people, is that many other civilizations, several other civilizations in Mesopotamia, also wrote records of this great flood. The Sumerians wrote a record of a great flood which destroyed their civilization. The Akkadians left a record of a great flood which destroyed the civilizations before them. And the Assyrians, living much later, left a rather mangled record of a flood which clearly had never happened to them, and it was by their days simply a distant memory. Now, what is important is some of these records were indisputably written before Moses. The Sumerian record dates to around, the earliest texts date to around 2400 BC, which is certainly before the time that Moses lived. So there are other cultures which recorded this particular flood, and they wrote about it before Genesis did, before Genesis was written. Now, some people find that that's a little bit of a challenge, but in actual fact, you'll find, again, if you look at the Christadelphian magazine, our early brothers actually knew about this in the 19th century. When these clay tablets were discovered, our early brothers said, wow, look, other cultures wrote about this flood that occurred in Mesopotamia, and wow, these records are even older than Genesis. And they didn't see this as a threat to the Genesis record. They said, this proves the Genesis record. This is exactly what we would expect if there was a flood at that time, and some people survived it, and they left a record. This is an independent witness to the Genesis record of a flood at that time. And we should be grateful that we have that archaeological evidence, because it proves that the Bible knows what it's talking about. Now, what is remarkable is when we compare those other cultures' records of the flood, we find that when we compare them to the Genesis record, they stack up very badly. And what we find is that the Genesis record is unique in having a far more believable account. So when it comes to who really had the most accurate source of information about that flood, it becomes very apparent that the Genesis record had a unique access to a reliable source. Now let's have a look at this. We have here the Sumerian record of the flood, the Akkadian record of the flood. Then many centuries later, more than 2,000 years, nearly 2,000 years later, the Assyrian record of the flood, which is remarkable because the Assyrians, of course, never experienced this flood, and the Assyrians were a landlocked nation which never experienced big floods anyway. And theirs, we find, is only a distant memory, and theirs is the least accurate record of all. And what we find is that the Genesis record is the only record that shows any connection with reality. The Sumerians and Akkadians both say that Noah had only 7 days to build the ark, which is quite ridiculous. And Genesis, we're simply not even told. We can surmise from the text he may have had up to 100 years, but we're simply not told. Certainly the Assyrian idea that he only had 2 days is particularly ridiculous. And as you'll see, the Assyrian record, written much later than the others, is wildly inaccurate in this detail, and it was obviously written by Assyrians who had never even seen the beach. In the Sumerian and Akkadian records, we find the rain lasted 7 days and 7 nights, which simply isn't enough to generate the amount of water required. In the Assyrian record, we've only got 6 days and 7 nights. In the Genesis record, it's a far more accurate 40 days and 40 nights. What's very important is that we know from meteorological conditions of Mesopotamia that 7 days and 7 nights is not enough. But what we also know from the meteorological conditions of Mesopotamia is that a flood and flood conditions, rain conditions lasting over a month are entirely possible and have been recorded. So again, Genesis is connected directly with reality, whereas these are not. The rain conditions, the conditions of the flood, are described as heavy storms in the Sumerian, Akkadian and Assyrian records. And they describe the ark being tossed and jumping up and down on the waves, dramatically being turned over and tumbled, which is utterly ridiculous, since these kind of rain conditions could never create storms of that magnitude, because Noah was simply in the ark, simply not out on the open ocean. Genesis, in particular, requires a far more modest it provides a far more modest and sedate description of extremely heavy rains, but no amazing storms, thunder and lightning, and the ark jumping up and down from wave to wave. Very dramatic, but not remotely in the realm of reality. When it comes to the materials of the ark, again we find something curious. The Sumerian, Akkadian, and the Assyrian records are wildly inaccurate. The Sumerians don't even know what it was made of. The Akkadians and the Assyrians both say it was made from reeds. Now, you could try and build an ark the size of Noah's with reeds and pitch, and just let me know how you'd go. What the Assyrians and the Akkadians did not know, because they never made ships this large, is that there's a structural limit to reeds. You can build them of a certain size, after that they simply fall apart, because reeds are not strong enough. Instead, in the Genesis record, we have an entirely accurate record of an ark which was made with timber and pitched with pitch. So we find reeds and pitch in the Akkadian and Assyrian records because this was people who only ever built ships and small barges out of reeds, and all they were doing was copying or thinking about a story. They were reinterpreting an event the best way they could, and they didn't have access to a reliable record of what really happened. All of the sources record that the ark was enclosed, which is interesting. But two of the records, the Sumerian and the Akkadian record, do not describe the shape of the ark. That's important because they don't have access to accurate information about what the ark was really like. The Assyrian record, of course written by a landlocked Assyrian who had no clue about what boats are supposed to look like, happily describes to us the ark as the shape of a cube, which is about the worst shape you can possibly imagine for a boat. This guy's obviously never even seen a boat. Whereas the dimensions, the clear dimensions given in the ark, the shape of the ark, reveals to us a very stable barge built along the same kind of lines as modern barges today. Again, in the Sumerian and the Akkadian records, we find no details given of the ark's construction. The Assyrian mixes up a great big mess of details. It's got punting poles, which is ridiculous because there's nobody sitting on the outside trying to propel this thing down the river. It's got rooms and it's got 7 decks, but he doesn't know why. Punting poles, this again describes to us, that demonstrates that this Assyrian is simply describing the boats he's seen floating down the river. There's no way an ark the size of this could possibly be propelled by men using punting poles. Genesis, of course, describes that the ark was built with rooms and 3 decks and understands exactly what the function of those rooms were. And again, the Sumerian and the Akkadian descriptions of their ship, they don't have access to accurate details. Look at all these details they simply don't know about. They don't know the shape. They don't have any details of the internal construction. They don't even know the dimensions. The Assyrian makes a wild guess at 55 meters cubed, which is completely unrealistic. And of course, utterly impossible for a ship. The Genesis record describes an extremely large ship, which is, however, of dimensions which are realistic for a barge. So we find that key details revealed in the Genesis record show that it is unique. It has access to a genuine historical source. The material used, the size and the shape of the ark is far superior to the other records, some of which don't even know the details, and some of which provide details which are utterly unrealistic. We also know that in the Genesis record, Noah sends a raven first, and then later he sends out a dove. And we know that whatever types we may generate from this, or other lessons or spiritual lessons we may get, we know from the record itself that this had something to do with finding land. Now what's important is that when we have a look at information and the archaeological information from that era, we can find that this was actually standard naval practice. When Mesopotamian ships were going out in the open ocean, they used to send out a raven first and then a dove. They would send out a raven during times when they couldn't see land, because a raven would fly very high, and then as soon as it spotted land, it would fly directly towards it, and that would give you a reliable indicator of where land was. However, if the raven climbed, circled, flew, and then came back, you would know you were still so far away from land that even a raven couldn't see it, so you would take the raven back. But once that raven didn't come back, then later, you knew it could see land, and you would follow the raven in the direction in which it flew. Later, when the raven had already outstripped you and you were still travelling in this direction, you would send out a dove, because a dove was a short-range animal, and the faster it came back to you, the further you knew you were from land. And when finally the dove didn't come back to you, you knew that you were very, very close to land. And so this Important detail found in Genesis shows that this is attached to a genuine historical event. Noah is doing what people really did do in those days. Now, what is remarkable is that the other records, the Sumerian, the Akkadian, the Assyrian record, they have no idea what to do with this. They record the detail, but they don't know why. And one of the other records, actually has Noah sending out the dove first, and then the raven. Now, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Nobody ever did that, because there's absolutely no good reason for doing that. And it shows that the person who was writing that record had no clue what the real purpose of the raven and the dove was, because he had no idea about boats, and he had no accurate source of information about this historical event. Once again, we find key details of the Genesis record prove that the writer had access to an accurate historical source. Something else that is very interesting about the record in Genesis is that the ark travels north up towards Ararat and not south down toward the Persian Gulf. This is remarkable because if the flood was actually worldwide, it would naturally drain out through the Persian Gulf, and the ark would follow the flow of water, and the ark would actually travel south. But local floods in this area block the Persian Gulf with strong winds, and those strong winds actually cause the water to move north. Now, that is something that can only be known by somebody who has experienced this as a historical event, or who has access to someone who experienced it as a historical event. That important detail was not even known meteorologically. That meteorological detail was not even known about Mesopotamia until the 19th century. Now, that's really remarkable, and it shows that the record of Genesis had access to unique, historically accurate information. Not only that, but all those strange dates and times that we find in the Genesis record, the second month and the 17th day, the third month, the 7th to the 10th months, all those strange dates that we find, when we look at those dates, we can reliably match those dates up to specific meteorological events in Mesopotamia. And then suddenly we realize that date information in the Genesis record gives us an understanding that shows that the Genesis record was really using accurate historical information. We find that the flood starts in the second month on the 17th day of the month. Now, this is the season of spring, and during this time in Mesopotamia, this is the time when you would get danger of a mega flood. This is when you get what was called a stalled frontal system, when you get the Tigris River flooding from enormous rains pouring down and snow melting through the spring season, snow melting from the mountains causing Tigris to flood. And these winds, the Suhaili and the Shakat winds, which actually block the Persian Gulf and blow from the south up and cause enormous flooding right across the Mesopotamian flood basin. And that all these meteorological conditions coincide and come together in the spring, which is exactly when we are told the flood started. We are told that the rains finished when the third month had ended. And we can back this up with the meteorological conditions. We find that 40 days and 40 nights rain end just as the rainy season ends at the end of the third month. So again, this is somebody who's describing a real historical event. When the Genesis account tells us that during the 4th to the 6th months, the waters gradually recede. And again, this matches the meteorological conditions of the Mesopotamia region. These are the hottest and driest months of Mesopotamia, and these are naturally the times when we find that the waters would be expected to recede. Then we find that from the 7th to the 10th month, for some reason, Noah stays inside the ark. And the reason for this is that the spring rains come again, the rainy season restarts, and so because of this, Noah rechecks the terrain to see if the rain is still covering the earth with water, or whether there is now terrain which is accessible to humans. Then we find from the 11th month back through the calendar to the 2nd month of the new year, we find there is warmer weather, the ground finally dries, light spring rains start, wheat ripens, there is a barley harvest, and appropriately that is the time when the Genesis record tells us the dove brings evidence of new life and new growth. And then finally Noah leaves the ark. So all those dates, those curious days and the times of the month in the Genesis record are extremely important because they show the events are directly attached to the historical meteorological conditions of the Mesopotamian regions. This shows that that record was written by somebody who was connected with real historical events. They had access to accurate historical information. Now the next question that people often ask is, well, okay, Noah's Ark, incredibly large ship. How is it remotely possible for people that long ago to build a ship anywhere near that size? Well, let's have a look at some ancient ships in antiquity which have been acknowledged by professional literature indisputably as having existed. This is one of the two Nemi ships named after the lake that they were found in. They were built by Caligula and they date to the 1st century in the time around the time of Jesus. This is one of the ships that was found. To scale, that's a man standing there. There's another man standing there. So these ships are absolutely enormous. This ship was 104 meters long, 340 feet long, by 20 meters wide, 60 meters wide. And that was built in the 1st century. That ship is larger than any ship built in Europe right up into the 18th century. European shipbuilders never mastered the technology to build ships this large. And this is why for many years people thought it was absolutely impossible for ancient people to build ships this large, because we never managed it, so I bet they couldn't either. But let's go back a little further. Let's go back a couple of hundred years even further into the past. And we find the Thalamagos, which was an immense Greek ship built about 200 years before Christ. And this one was even larger. It was 114 meters long, 377 feet, and around the same kind of dimensions. And I'm not talking about mythical ships. I'm not talking about ships which are only found in Greek legend. I've done the research and I can provide you with plenty of professional references. I can provide you with plenty of academic articles and books saying it's indisputable these ships actually existed. There's no dispute among historians that these ships really existed. And there's archaeological evidence for some of them, and there is textual evidence and historical evidence for some of them as well. Around the same time, we find the Textual, which was one of the largest ocean-going ships, definitely the largest ocean-going wooden ship ever built. And this thing was absolutely enormous. This was approaching the size of the Ark. It was 128 meters, 420 feet long, and 17.5 meters wide, or 58 feet wide. And you can see what is also remarkable is that the dimensions and that the proportions of these ships are remarkably similar to the size of the Ark, to the dimensions of the Ark. Extremely long, but always within these same kind of proportions, with a breadth of around 20 meters, or 50 to 60 feet, 58 to 60 feet. So it's remarkable that not only the size of the Ark is found in ancient ships, but even its proportions. But let's not stop there. Let's go back a little bit further. In fact, let's go back over 1,000 years. Let's go back to 1,480 years before the time of Christ. And now we are getting pretty close to the time of Noah. This was an obelisk barge built by the Egyptians. It was built under the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, and she built it to transport those giant obelisks down the Nile River. This thing was around 140 meters long. This thing was even larger than the Ark, 32 meters wide, around 104 feet wide. Now, we can see that there's one obelisk here. There are two obelisks carried. You can see a pointy end here, another pointy end here. There are two obelisks, and they are being carried end to end. This ship is remarkable because of the amount of historical evidence we have for its existence. Firstly, we have this actual mural on the side of an Egyptian building. We actually have an image of it carved into the side of this Egyptian building, so we know what it actually looked like. Secondly, we find that it is capable carrying two of these obelisks end to end. And the reason why that is useful is because one of those obelisks is still standing today. And because we know how long one of those obelisks was, we know how long two of them were. And this is one of those obelisks. There it is there. Let's go down until we find a person standing there. So that ship, as we can see clearly, was carrying two of these things end to end. So it's very easy to get a rough estimate of how long this ship actually was. You take one of these, you double it, and then you add some extra leg for the prow and stern of the ship, just as the requirements of the ship would indicate, and the illustration indicates, and then you get a very reliable indication of exactly how large the ship was. And there's no dispute among professional historians that this ship actually existed. There's a clear record of it, there's an actual depiction of it, a visible depiction of it, there's a record of how long it was, and we have one of the obelisks showing us clear physical evidence of exactly how long this was. So there is clear physical evidence that in fact the ark, the size that is described in the Genesis record, definitely could have been built, and in fact the ancient people were capable of building these ships and even larger ships. And there's indisputable historical evidence of this. And this is extremely important because the Genesis flood, and in particular the record of the ark itself, is, as I've said previously, comes under particular attack by atheists. But we have good, solid, reliable archaeological evidence from a range of professional sources which provides us with good reasons for believing the record of the Genesis flood and for understanding it is far more accurate than any of the other ancient records of that flood. Now I come to the third section here. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I know we are starting to run short of time. What is important, what I want to show to you are a few sources of information which can provide us with reliable information indicating the history of the New Testament, particularly in the book of Acts and also in the book of Luke, is reliable. There's one author you will find quoted by some earlier Christadelphians called Sherwood White. He wrote in the 1960s. He was a historian, but his work is now considered unreliable. Not only that, but he's not particularly useful for proving the accuracy of the New Testament, because as far as he was concerned, Luke apparently sometimes made mistakes, and he was also prepared to say that Luke was a bit of a propagandist and exaggerated things. So if you see Sherwood White quoted as an authority on the history of the New Testament, you should be a little bit skeptical. He's quite prepared to admit that Luke made mistakes. And also he considers that Acts is a bit of a propaganda narrative which is subject to distortions by its author. In any case, Sherwood White, who wrote in the 1960s, is now considered by professional historians to be way out of date, and there are far more modern, reliable historians which we can use to prove the Acts record is accurate, and the New Testament history is also accurate. It's true that the book of Acts and the book of Luke have both come under fire, and people have challenged their historical accuracy. But, as this commentator says, at the same time it must be admitted that such indictments against Luke as a historian are not so firmly based as is sometimes claimed. And in fact, recent examination of that evidence has encouraged a much more positive assessment of the historical reliability of the book of Acts. And what you will find when you examine the professional literature, and I'm talking about secular scholars, I'm talking about people who don't even believe in the Bible. Ludemann, this Bible scholar, Ludemann, he is actually an atheist. He doesn't even believe in the Bible. But he is prepared to believe that yes, there were appearances of the heavenly Jesus in Jerusalem. These are Ludemann's own words. Now we might find that extraordinary claim, a statement from an atheist. So Ludemann acknowledges there is clear, undeniable historical evidence that there were men who were preaching a risen Jesus. He says, we can't deny there's evidence for that. And we can't deny that they saw something. So he says, well, I think they just had some kind of hallucination. Now, as far as I'm concerned, it's a complete cop-out. If you've gone as far as acknowledging the existence of Jesus and the existence of the apostles, and you've acknowledged that there's so much historical evidence that they really had a vision of Jesus, then it's a bit of a cop-out to turn around and say, oh, okay,